What's up, Outliers? Welcome to another episode of Performance Bites for bite-sized insights into complex subjects in health and performance. Today, we're going to talk about zone training, but we actually need to understand heart rate and understand energy systems and stuff like that. So we'll kind of break down what those look like and then also what the zones are. So as we go through this, we're going to kind of be piecing things together, but we'll make sure that we wrap it all up there at the end. Zone training is super important in periodization as well, which is why I've made sure to incorporate it into all the programs that I write for Outlier. Whether it's a pre-made program or a custom program, I've got you covered. So if you're interested in working with Outlier and getting a program, hit the link in the description below, which is outlierathlete.com. Go check it out. We got things across the board kind of made up for everyone and making sure that we're using solid periodization to help you get where you want to get and reach the goals that you want to reach. So the first thing that we need to go over is the energy systems. And there's three main energy systems, and we can kind of break it down a little bit more within those energy systems. But we have our creatine phosphate, our glycolytic, and also our oxidative. So when we're using high intensity sprints, jumps, big lifts, things that are only lasting about 10 seconds, that's going to be our creatine phosphate. And that one is exactly what it sounds like, creatine and a phosphate. Very explosive, but not a huge yield of ATP is able to be replenished in that state. So we'll fall out of it fairly quickly if we continue on. We continue on with our exercise, our intensity and stuff like that is going to slightly drop, but we're going to go into our glycolytic, which means glycogen or glucose. We're using carbohydrates, and we're going to basically split that up into two categories: in anaerobic, so presence of no oxygen, and then our aerobic, where oxygen is present. If we kind of keep that simple, we're going to have that zone last roughly 2 minutes at tops. So once we surpass that creatine phosphate, the 10 seconds, we're going to switch into our glycolytic state. And we're using carbohydrate, sugar, stored sugar, which is that glycogen, to basically run the body. And we're going to get actually more ATP replenishment during that time. So we can stay longer in it. And that's why we can go up to that 2 minutes. Now, with that being said, there's a lot of byproduct that occurs when we're using this energy system. And that's where a lot of people are familiar with hearing lactate. So lactate will build up as a byproduct during glycolytic or glucose use, carbohydrate use. And when we're getting that, we can actually replenish it for energy, which is pretty cool. I've talked about this a little bit in a couple of different episodes, but glucose is essentially a 6-carbon molecule, and it gets split up through the process in our body that basically is going to create ATP, and we'll get about 38 ATP through that process, which is called the Krebs cycle. Don't have to go super in depth. I would need to probably follow a sheet to even tell you exactly what the Krebs cycle really looks like. But there's a lot that's kind of going on in that cycle, but we can create more ATP in that. But we can also use what's called the Cori cycle to take lactate and actually bring it to the liver, and some processes happen there. And then we can actually create more glucose and so forth, so forth. So pretty fun state, but that's probably the state that a lot of people will experience when they're doing bouts of exercise that are more than 10 seconds, but less than 2 minutes. Then lastly, we have our oxidative or our fat oxidation state, where we're actually using oxygen and burning primarily fat for fuel. This is obviously going to be our more low intensity cardiovascular training, and that's going to yield long duration, because the body is able to actually create a load of ATP, a lot of ATP in this state. And compared to these other ones that don't have very much, this is over 100. So when we look at it that way, we get the creatine phosphate, which is only yielding 1 to 2 ATP replenishment. Meanwhile, the glycolytic, 38, and now we're getting into the hundreds. So quite a big difference. Even as I sit here, I'm in my fat oxidation state, with my heart rate fairly low. Would be lower if I wasn't speaking and all this jazz. But with that being the case, I'm going to get a lot of ATP a lot of replenishment of energy to use. So I know this is about zone training, but it's really important to understand these energy systems, because when we look at zone training, we're actually trying to either use these energy systems to our advantage or even sometimes to our disadvantage, depending on what we're trying to essentially like facilitate. Now, if we're looking at this from a place of, the zone training, we basically break up zone training into 5 zones. So 1 through 5, 1 is the lowest, 5 is the highest. What this really is zone 1 is 50 to 60% of your maximum heart rate. Zone 2, 60, 70, 3, 70, 80, 4, 80, 90, and 5, 90, 100. So actually pretty easy mathematical calculations when we look at it that way. Our sponsor today is Intake Breathing. Intake Breathing is an innovative nasal strip to actually help dilate your nostrils and help you have better airflow through them. So I always say, breathe through your nose, not through your mouth. We got our breathe hole and we have our feed hole. Intake is a great tool to be able to make sure that you're breathing better through your breathe hole and not through your feed hole. I'm a big fan of using it at night to help me breathe through my nostrils and actually slow my respiratory rate at night to facilitate better recovery. But I also use it when I'm doing my longer duration work because it's definitely helpful for dilating and increasing oxygen flow, but also helping to increase nitric oxide to get into the system, dilate our veins, and increase blood flow. So if you're interested in checking them out, go over to intakebreathing.com/outlierathlete and use code outlierathlete for 15% off your order. But what do we use each one of these zones for is kind of what is important to look into here. So when we look at the zones, our zone 1 is really kind of like a place we would go. Somebody's like, I want you to go into an active recovery state. And so that could actually be a state in between exercise reps. So if you're doing 4 sets of something, and you need to rest in between, you're likely going to bop down into your zone 1, and that's going to be your recovery state. Now, if you had a intense competition and you're trying to just like flush metabolically stuff out of your system so that you can recover quicker, that's going to be your zone 1, which once again is at 50 to 60% of your maximum heart rate. Now, we'll get into the formulas of what that actually looks like, but hang with me. Zone 2 has become a very popular zone thanks to many podcasts talking about it, but it's actually like a health and longevity zone, but it's also so good for performance because it builds a great aerobic base. And what's actually occurring adaptation-wise during this is we're developing more capillary density, which our capillaries help to transfer nutrient to our muscles out of our arteries and flush out into the veins and stuff like that. So these little guys are really important. If we can develop more capillaries, we can shoot and also get more out of the tissue, which is definitely a performance advantage. Another thing is we develop mitochondrial density. So more mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell. That's where that ATP is really actually coming from. So the more mitochondria we have in the tissue, the more energy that we can essentially have from them, which I would definitely say is a huge performance advantage. This zone is what we're going to really be using when we're trying to gain a lot of aerobic ability, because we're going to use that fat oxidation and that good source of energy storage, essentially, to be able to go longer durations, go longer distances, but our intensity is going to stay lower, right? Because I mentioned zone 2 is 60 to 70% of maximum heart rate. So to go that longer distance in this zone, we obviously have to remain in a lower intensity. And then we'll get the benefits of, utilizing fat for energy, developing more mitochondria, and developing more capillaries, which then will play into the higher zones and the other energy systems as well. Now, zone 3 is the 70 to 80%. This is a really unique zone because this is where a lot of people will make the switch from aerobic to slightly anaerobic, and also switch from fat utilization for energy to actually glucose, carbohydrate for energy as well. Where that happens in the zone really depends upon the person and their fitness level, and also even their muscle fiber type. So we have the slow twitch and we have fast twitch. So depending upon a lot of the physiology of the individual is going to dictate where that switch occurs. But usually it's going to be kind of at the midway point. We can say that safely. And, some people even are capable of having their threshold, which we would call that lactate threshold, to actually exist up in zone 4. And so it just really kind of depends on the individual. And obviously the people that have a higher ability to go to higher heart rates before they switch into their glycogen or their glucose have a major advantage for longer duration as far as like energy use and also that ATP development. So I mentioned the lactate threshold, and the lactate threshold essentially is where our body is no longer able to buffer the lactate that is building up in the bloodstream, in the system, to be able to keep it level. So when we hit lactate threshold, that's where a lot of people will experience discomfort of, the burning sensation, the pumps and stuff like that, just because there's a lot of hydrogen in the system, essentially, which is going to start to mess with pH a little bit and make things a little more uncomfortable. But obviously, if you were to continue trying going at that level for, whatever, 5 more minutes, you're going to experience a shutdown in performance. So your performance is going to decrease. And that's the body basically saying, hey, we can't continue at this because our buffering is not able to keep up. So we're going to have to lower your intensity. And so like if you're like on a bike looking at wattage, that's where we see like a big drop of wattage. And until the body can essentially catch up. Usually it's going to continue to kind of suck until you take a break. Anyone that's reached that point knows exactly what I'm talking about. But what you can do is you can flirt with that threshold a little bit. So if you figure out kind of the heart rate zone area where your threshold starts to kick in, you can flirt with that in intervals. So zone 3 is a great place to work intervals. And I like to do it in a more of like a 2-to-1 work the rest. So if you're doing a 4-minute interval, you take 2 minutes off and then you repeat that. So it kind of allows you to recover just enough to be able to get back into it. But the intensity is still in the zone 3. So that's really important to note, because if you try this ratio of work to rest in zone 4 or zone 5, you're not going to elicit the adaptations that you're actually trying to get with that buffering of the lactate and pressing your lactate threshold over and actually increasing it. So it's really important to make sure that you don't exceed it and get into those different zones unless you are one of those unique individuals that has done, VO2 max testing with lactate testing and stuff like that. And you actually know that your lactate threshold exists in a higher zone. Otherwise, you're going to have to kind of just take, the science for what it is and go, okay, I feel this way at this heart rate. So I'm not going to, exceed that for my 4 minutes. And then I'm going to recover back into my zone 1 for those 2 minutes and repeat that interval until I can push that further. Now, zone 4 is getting up there. So it's at 80 to 90%. And if we go back to the energy systems, we had the fat oxidation, then our glycolytic, where it was aerobic and anaerobic. This is definitely more in the anaerobic state of using glucose as energy. It's also called our lactate system or lactic system. So within this, we can push pretty hard, but remember, we can't push for very long. So we're going to see our intervals kind of switch up a little bit more. And it's funny because a lot of people be like, well, I'm working at 80 or 90% of maximum heart rate, but your output is going to be really low if you try and continue. And that's, like I said, that's your body trying to basically bring you back down so it can recover and also get enough, fuel back in the system so they can go more. So intervals is a really great way of working this. This is also like a really good state to increase that lactate threshold as well. Like I said, it kind of teeters depending upon the person. So if you are doing intervals in zone 4, you will see an increase in your lactate threshold, but it's unlikely that you're going to be able to continue for as long a duration as you would have in zone 3 for the lactate. But you can start to train your VO2 max. So the max amount of consumption that you can take in of oxygen per minute when you start to train in zone 4 with these intervals. This is going to look a lot different than the intervals that you did in zone 3, where the intervals were a 2-to-1 work to the rest. We're going to go with more of a 1-to-1 or a 1-to-2 type work ratio, where say they're going to be shorter, about a minute, or even 30 seconds. We'll go with 30 seconds. So it's a 30-second bout at 80% of maximum heart rate, 80 to 90, and then you're going to take a minute recovery. So you're going to be able to go longer than 10 seconds because you're going 30 seconds, but you're staying in that glycolytic energy zone. And then you're going to recover for a minute to allow everything to kind of rejuice and get bumped back up with energy. You can do this for, longer or more intervals than, say, the amount of intervals you would have done for zone 3, but your total volume is going to overall be less because you're doing 30 seconds of work compared to 4 minutes of work for, 3 or 4 rounds. Now, obviously, this is working our fast twitch, big muscle groups when we're doing it, which is wonderful, especially if you're training for some more powerful movements. Not going to be quite as powerful as what we'll get into with zone 5, but it's definitely going to be helpful in developing bigger and stronger muscles to be able to use in athletics or in daily life. All right, so zone 5, the last zone, the big zone, 90 to 100% of maximum heart rate. So zone 5 is a very, very, very high intense. And the thing about zone 5 that's really interesting too is you have to build up into it. So it's kind of funny with untrained individuals, you'll see them actually peak up higher into this zone and quicker than a trained individual. Because essentially the body, when trained, is a master of using the least amount of energy as possible. And that's its goal. The body's goal is to always do the least amount of work possible. So it becomes very good at its efficiency, essentially. So for a trained individual, you'll see it takes just a little bit longer for them to get into a zone 5 and achieve that high intensity compared to, say, an untrained individual will peak out a little bit quicker. But that's a good thing as a trained individual. Just makes it a little bit harder for your high intensity stuff. So zone 5, 90 to 100% of maximum heart rate. This is where we're going to see like sprints, all out sprints, big jumps, big powerful movements like weightlifting movements of, clean snatches, jerks, and stuff like that. And overall, just big, powerful, quick movement. Like I said, it only lasts about 10 seconds. So we're kind of in this small little window, but it also means that our rest is going to extend much longer than like what we're talking about with the zone 3 and zone 4. So we're going to want to see longer rest periods, pretty long. So if we're doing like, say it's a 100-meter sprint, which, most people aren't doing that in 10 seconds. If you are, congratulations, you should be D1 athlete. But if you're doing a 100-meter sprint, you're likely going to get into your zone 5 for its duration and then probably drop into zone 4. But when you're doing that, you're going to need a big amount of recovery if you did achieve 10 seconds in zone 5. So recovery is going to extend up to 12 to 15 times work, which we just mathematically look at that. That's going to be about 2 to 3 minutes. So you're 10 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds, 2 to 3 minute recovery, maybe even longer. But this is developing a lot of neuromuscular connection because the amount of force that is having to be generated during that is super, super high. So we're kind of bypassing the smaller muscles, which usually when we do movement, even like a heavy deadlift, we're activating the small muscles first, small muscles being the slow twitch fibers, and then we activate the fast twitch fibers because we kind of get like that preload. But when we're doing sprinting or big jumps or plyometrics and stuff like that, that takes too long, especially when ground contact is, 0.1 of a second. So the body is actually able to skip over those slow twitch fibers and just use the fast twitch fibers, which is pretty cool. But what that's going to mean is we're going to have an increased amount of neuromuscular connection during those because it's just high voltage, quick, over and over and over again throughout that duration. So zone 5 is super cool, but it's also, I would say, like not something you want to do multiple times a week. Same with zone 4. We want to utilize it, but not overutilize it. Zone 3, definitely more available a few times a week. Meanwhile, zone 2, you could do nearly every single day. So just keep that in mind. Like just because zone 5 is such a high intensity and it seems fun and cool to do those things, It doesn't mean that you're going to be capable of doing that because it's going to tax the nervous system so much more. And even though you might not feel as sore, but you're going to be taxed in different ways. So do keep that in mind with those higher zones. We want to make sure we're utilizing them, but not overutilizing them. Honestly, once a week is going to be enough if you're getting into a zone 4 or zone 5. Zone 3, you could get away with doing twice a week. In zone 2, you can, like I said, you could do 5-6 times a week. Zone 1, we kind of live in zone 1, even if we're like up and walking around. So obviously you can do that one every day. So I keep on talking about, a percentage of heart rate max. So it's important to go over how to calculate a heart rate max. Per individual is going to look really different. A standard, very quick way that I'm not super in love with, but it is a way that you can do this, is 220 minus age is a predictor for heart rate max. It's actually not a far off measurement of heart rate max. So for example, I'm 31 years old. 220 minus 31 is 189. So that would be my predicted heart rate max. Now I have done training and testing to know that my heart rate max is actually 194, which is totally normal for trained individuals to have a heart rate that is, or a heart rate max that actually exceeds the mathematical. Obviously, this is just math. It's not perfect. So 194 is my actual, but 189 would be my predicted, which is 5 points off. It's not too far off. So here's where things get a little bit different, because if I'm going to just take this 189 and I'm going to multiply it by 0.6, so I'm going to talk about my zone 2. I'm going to calculate my zone 2. So if I'm going to do 0.6 of my 189, that's going to give me 113 beats per minute. Fairly low, actually. That's very, very low. And then my 0.7 is 132. So 113 to 132 would be a zone 2 based upon this calculation. Is that perfect? No, it's absolutely not. It's going to be much, that's a little bit too low for a trained individual. So there is a method called the Karvonen method. And this actually is going to take into account an individual's resting heart rate, which actually is very indicative of a person's cardiovascular ability and where they're at in their training and overall fitness. So my resting heart rate is 46. So this is going to look slightly different mathematically. So I'm going to stick with the 189 because that's what I used when I just did my 0.6 and 0.7. So I'm going to take 189 minus my resting heart rate, 46. Then I'm going to multiply that by the 0.6. And then I'm going to add back the 46 of my resting heart rate. That gives me 131. So I'm already at almost the peak of my zone 2 based upon that other calculation. Then if I do that by 0.7 instead of 0.6, everything's the same, of my 189 minus 46 times 0.7 plus the 46 back, then I get 146. So that is actually much getting adaptation and be getting everything that I needed from it. And I might be working out of too low of state compared to what my zone 2 actually is capable of, as far as like a wattage output or a speed or a pace or something like that. Now, since my resting heart rate is 46, but my max heart rate is actually 194, if I do that formula again, taking into account my resting heart rate, I actually get 135 to 150 is my zone 2. So with that being the case, my zone 3 would exist, 15 points higher, 150 to 165, and then 165, 180, so forth. So my personal lactate threshold actually sits up at my zone 4, which is kind of crazy to say, but that's where, I've had tests done, and I'm also have a background as a sprinter. So my muscle fibers are very fast twitch and very capable of flushing things out through my training just throughout the duration of my life. So my lactate threshold exists in my zone 4, which is quite nice and actually a huge benefit because that doesn't happen until about 172 heart rate for me. That's unique and it's good. And so if somebody has that ability to do that, their threshold is going to be higher. But it seems kind of crazy because when I say go for a run, I can run at a 160 heart rate and feel just fine for a couple hours. That's because I'm actually working in a zone that is capable of doing that. My output might not be high, but my heart rate is right where it needs to be. Now, this is going to be so different for everyone, which is why it's important to calculate these things. Some wearables, like a watch or something, do calculate it, but it's not perfect. And that's where even my watch doesn't calculate through the Karvonen method, even though it says it does. It doesn't, because I've done the math. So definitely take these formulas in mind. I'm going to drop them in the description below so that you can actually calculate them for yourself and find out what works best for you and your resting heart rate. If you don't know your max, that's where just doing the 220 minus age is a really good tool, because like I said, it's only 5 points off for myself. That's fairly close. So if you know your resting heart rate, at least you can get a pretty good calculation of what your zones are going to look like. With all that being said, zone training is super helpful to be able to calculate where you're going to be at with certain heart rates and what adaptations you're going to elicit, and then also what energy systems you're going to use, because you can use it to your advantage to develop more, or to your disadvantage in the way of working at high zones to buffer things. So kind of just depends on what you're going for or what your coach has you doing, but zone training definitely is kind of the way to go if you want to get, certain performance gains in this area, that area. But it is important to understand what each one is and what's happening within them. So a lot of information, but hopefully you followed along well. And if you have questions, please drop them in the comments below. Otherwise, please like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff so we can get this information out, but also keep growing Outlier. And yeah, so thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.